everybody, today at long last I am finally driving the Aston Martin V12 Vanquish as everybody thinks it should have been, complete with manual gearbox, and I'm bringing you along for the ride. This is actually the third time I have driven an Aston Martin V12 Vanquish. In case you are wondering, the V12 bit in the name is what separates this from its later also Vanquish successor, commonly called by many the Vanquish 2. For the benefit of those who haven't seen my previous videos, a quick potted history on the model. It was introduced first as Project Vantage back in the late 1990s, essentially a vision of Aston Martin's future. And it was a car that was desperately needed because, you have to remember, at the time the Aston Martin lineup consisted of essentially two cars. The Virage, or Vantage, which itself was built on a platform that could trace its roots all the way back to the 1960s, and the DB7, which was a far fresher affair, but just about everybody knows and knew that underneath you would in fact find the underpinnings of an old Jaguar XJS, which could then trace its roots back to the 1970s. It was also powered in initial form by a Jaguar engine, so to many it wasn't really an Aston Martin at all. This though was designed to be, from the ground up, all new and, more importantly, all Aston. At the heart of this new car was an all-new engine, replacing the venerable Tedek V8, which had served the company for near 30 years. It was a 5.9-litre, 12-cylinder, 48-valve masterpiece. Though many will call it simply two Ford V6s welded together, that's not actually really that true. And though there is some commonality between the two engines, only where the Ford part was already up to spec. It actually made its debut in the DB7 Vantage, which some felt took away from the allure of this car, but I think as they laid eyes on what was then called the Vanquish, they realised this was a very different proposition. Not only is it a gorgeous thing to look at, and I'll admit, when it was new and I was young, I didn't really like it. Today, I've changed my tune. More importantly, underneath, it was about as fresh and innovative as they got. So you have a chassis made of bonded extruded aluminium with large sections of carbon fibre. Even today, this would be a fairly classy affair. The panels were aluminium, hand-finished at the Newport Pagnell factory, and this was the final new Aston Martin to be built there. So it's really a car that bridges both the old and the new. And, perhaps even better, it was the car that brought James Bond back to Aston Martin. And let's be honest here, it is the best thing about Die Another Day. This being said, even when new, the Vanquish did have a few issues. The first of which was the interior. Though the exterior was generally very well regarded, and the interior certainly had its fair share of premium materials, it also raided the Ford parts bin a little bit more than it should have done for a car that cost quite as much as it did. In fact, Dr. Ulrich Betz, who became Aston Martin's chair in the early 2000s, wasn't very happy with it, and I recall reading an article where he looked inside the prototype Vanquish, turned to his engineers and said, "Really? That's what we're going with? Huh." And the other big problem, one that many consider to be the car's Achilles heel, was the fact it was never offered with a manual gearbox. In fact, the only transmission you ever had for this was a robotized manual, what Ferrari owners would call F1, BMW, SMG, and Audi R-Tronic. It was clunky, it was slow, it was unintuitive, and generally speaking, people hated it. And then, in 2003, the Vanquish's biggest problem arrived, called the DB9. Here was the next step in Aston Martin's evolution, and a car that not only moved the game on from the DB7, but many would argue also the Vanquish. It featured a slightly lower state of tune version of the 5.9-litre V12, making just 450 horses versus the Vanquish's 460, but the fact was, it was a significantly lighter car. More importantly, it also came with a much more modern automatic gearbox, or should you want it a manual? The car was also not just gorgeous to look at, but also beautiful inside. It addressed nearly all the criticism of these and presented buyers with, I think, a far more tempting proposition. The fact it also happened to be quite a bit cheaper than its bigger brother only served to seal the deal. And so, in 2004, Aston Martin set about revising the Vanquish and turning it into the Vanquish S. This involved a subtle alteration to the car's exterior, the main differences being a new lip at the front and a slightly more aggressive profile for the spoiler at the rear. The car then saw improvements to the steering, suspension and the brakes, which had been previewed on the previous Vanquish S Dynamic Pack. Then, to round it all off, the car's engine was beefed up significantly and power rose from 460 horses to 520, with torque going from 400 to 425 pound-foot. That's 576 newton-meters. A change of final drive then meant that while the 0 to 60 speed quoted was actually marginally slower than in the original, top speed rose to an all-important 200+ mph. And from 2005, the S became the only Vanquish you could buy, with the last significant revision being in 2006, when the car saw a new interior, adopting some of the tech and style of the DB9. Today, I'm told people actually aren't really that fussed anymore, with some preferring this earlier, more sort of Ford-feeling interior, and others preferring the later one. The only real significant difference beyond style being the fact, if you do want some modern technology, if you buy a car with the later setup, you can now retrofit Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. However, from factory, Aston Martin never fixed what many considered to be the car's greatest weakness, the gearbox. Every single Vanquish out there was sold with the robotised manual. And so, while the car was still in production, Aston Martin Works themselves offered a conversion service. The benefit of the car having a robotised manual is the fact that at its heart, it's still a manual gearbox. And so, those who craved a 3-pedal and stick experience could get one, for the sum of, back in the day, around £20,000. And it's one of those cars that you find me driving today. It's an example of an early Vanquish S with the original interior, but that has been converted by Works to a manual. And I like it a lot. I want to say a big thank you to both this car's owner, Simon, and also to Nicholas Me for making today happen. They're a lovely bunch of people, and if you happen to be in the market for a car, not just like this, but actually this, then I'd recommend giving them a call. I had a lovely tour of the workshop this morning and all their facilities, and I have to say, if I was in the market for an Aston of this type, I'd certainly be giving them a ring. Now, like I said, this is actually not the first time I've driven a V12 Vanquish, nor is it even the second. However, both of the first two I drove each had something a little bit wrong with them. The first example was a weird hybrid of both the original Vanquish and the later S. It started life as an SDP, so had essentially the suspension and chassis modifications of an S, but without the power. It unfortunately also came on rather old Yokohama tyres, and the clutch was also on its last legs. So, when I went to put my foot down and have a little bit of fun, the car did not want to. The second example I drove was then a later factory S. However, this had also been modified, fitted with a GM-sourced torque converter automatic. Designed really to fix the issues of the single clutch automated manual, but that to me actually made them a little bit worse, because it wasn't particularly great when you didn't want to shift gears yourself, and then it was terrible when you did. This, though, is far more like it. Now, I have to say, I have a bit of an on-off relationship with Aston Martin manuals, particularly modern ones, though I always love the idea of a nice, big, hairy-chested engine combined with manual gearbox. The fact is, most modern-day Aston manuals just aren't really all that nice. From the V8 Vantage to the DBS, they don't really work all that well. The clutch in particular tends to be a little finicky. The cars then are ridiculously easy to stall, and the gear lever never feels like it's in the right place. Here at least they have a little bit of an excuse for it, because the car was designed not to have one. However, the rest of them, not quite sure exactly what happened there. However, this, likely because it was done by Aston Martin Works, genuinely feels like a very OEM product. The clutch is still a little bit awkward, the pedal is quite heavy, and yet still the car feels relatively easy to stall. I haven't managed it yet, but I live in constant fear. Once on the move though, things improve dramatically. The throw of the box is actually quite short, the action is fairly heavy, and it suits this car, I think, rather nicely. It's not the magic experience of, say, the 550's gated shifter, but I wasn't really expecting that. It is certainly better than I thought. My driving position also means that actually the lever isn't anywhere near quite as awkward as I thought it was going to be. The rest of the car then, well, I have to say, this is by far the best Vanquish I have driven. It's on very low miles, just over 18,000, but miraculously, it's also on a fresh set of Yokohama tyres. In fact, we had them put on just for this review, and so I need to say an extra special thank you to Simon for being very patient with me and allowing me to drive the car on my terms. Now, the compromise was that this is not my chosen test route, and you can probably tell I am driving places I don't know and getting a little bit lost. However, I have had a fair bit of seat time in the car thus far, and it's just spectacular. I mean, the V12 Vanquish S as a whole, it's full of gorgeous little details, from the scalloped side sills you don't really seem to appreciate until you're stood in front of the car. Then when you open the engine bay, you're greeted with these nice pieces of carbon fibre, that beautiful strut brace that looks just exquisite. I even love the little ducts which I think go down to the cats and help them vent hot air. Just magnificent. In here then, yes, sure, there's plenty of Ford switchgear and stuff, but also there's gorgeous details like this speaker surround here and the Aston Martin badging, these little grab handles down here, the acreage of leather, this beautiful diamond-stitched headlining. And you know something? I now think the Vanquish is a spectacular looking thing too. One of my big criticisms of the later cars, particularly those from sort of DB9 up until really the second gen Vanquish, is that they do all look fairly similar. This, though, is quite distinctive. It's more classic in its profile. The DB9 is a very flat car. This has far more curves about it. In fact, my favourite detail is the way that that front arch then meets the door on the side, and though I've always thought the sort of DB4 GT inspired arches at the back were a little bit iffy, these days they've grown on me. And then there's the drive. It's spectacular. It's a proper GT car, this. You have to remember that somehow, despite the fact it's made of aluminium and carbon fibre and all that sort of lovely stuff, it was still heavier than the 550, which was made in a much more old-fashioned way, a steel chassis and aluminium bodywork. This also feels like a slightly less pointy car, the 550 more up on its toes, more agile, yet the Vanquish counters with stability, poise, pace, and pretty darn good steering feel. The last two I drove weren't spectacular. This is definitely better. Those new tyres certainly helping, and I am told by the owner the tyres have also made the ride just that little bit more supple. It's firm but compliant, and I've driven this car earlier over a few sections that were pretty rough, a few undulating elements which I know would have many a supercar crying out in agony. This, though, took it in its stride. I'm very impressed. The engine also. It's a powerhouse. Torque from nearly nothing. It's a wondrous thing. And to me, I think this is probably one of the last times where the Aston Martin could really go toe-to-toe with the Ferrari of its day, which in this case would have been the 575. Granted, once the 599 arrived, things changed. I think really permanently. Look then years later, and even the DBS just couldn't hold a candle to the likes of the F12. But let's be honest here, it's 520 horsepower. How much do you really need? I know it weighs 1.8 tons, but it doesn't matter. It's a joy to drive. The view out is sensational. The brakes are decent, not the most communicative pedal, but they've got no issue stopping the car, and they're certainly better than in the early models. Makes a great noise too, this thing. Really, really does. this is going to cause me a problem. This really is. Because, you see, I've got my DB9, but that's not going to be a permanent resident in the JAYEMM fleet. And I'm thinking next year of changing it for something else, likely a DBS, or a later Vanquish. Now, though, I feel like to ignore one of these would be an error on my part. Particularly with that manual. I mean, who doesn't want a V12 manual? I know I've got one already, but it's good to have a spare. I haven't even seen my 550 all year, so if you're wondering why there hasn't been any content on that car, that's why. I haven't had it to make any. I will explain what's going on in a future video. These, in case you're wondering, aren't going to be the easiest thing to look after. Even Nicholas Mee said to me, look, realistically, where say a DB9 might cost you 1,500 quid a year to run, a good one of these is still going to cost you 2.5. And that's before you encounter any issues. Parts supply has been an issue in the past with Aston Martins, not just the Vanquish. However, in recent times I am told they have improved somewhat. Even so, these will be just a little trickier to get bits for than, say, your DB9, V8 Vantage, so on and so forth. The automated manual, I know, would be a deal breaker for quite a few people, and there's an equal number out there who also wouldn't be interested in this manual. And for them, a DB9 is just going to be a better shout. The big shock for me is that actually in the last few years, these have come down in price by quite a bit. There was a time when even to get in a regular Vanquish, you were going to be paying near £100,000, but not anymore. They appear in the classifieds for less than 60. However, to get a good one, Nicholas Mee say you probably want to pay at least about 65, and for an S, at least about 80. Today, a manual conversion will add to the value roughly about what it costs to do, so between £15,000 and £25,000, give or take. This particular car is currently listed for sale at about 115 grand. Most of that justified by the fact it's on super low mileage. Currently, 18,233. And of course, there's also plenty of stuff that does still detract somewhat from the overall experience. The rubbishy switchgear, the cheap-looking Ford/Volvo key, and the fact that, I think because of the work that they've done, I can occasionally feel the steering column with my feet, which is a concern. The car, I think, actually has a slightly more useful boot than maybe in the DB9, but the rear seats are equally as useless. Speaking of the fronts, actually, I wish my Aston had these. Though they don't look quite as sexy as the later ones, they are just so much better. And in fairness, if you were to compare one of these with, say, a DB7, I really don't think they'd actually be any more hassle to run, and they're certain to be quite a bit cheaper than their predecessors, the V8, Virage, Vantage, all of those. They're notoriously expensive, simply a function of the way that they were made. Putting the car in reverse is fairly easy, you just push it all the way over to the right and up, and they have retained for reverse only the little sort of, I'm going to call it dot matrix screen up here. Sadly, when you're then in gear, it doesn't tell you what one you're using. That would have been a nice touch. I think my only real issue when it comes to enjoying the car has been the old-fashioned traction control, which is simply either on or off, and nothing in between. So there we have it. That is an Aston Martin V12 Vanquish S with the works manual conversion. And I have to say, it's been worth the wait. I've really enjoyed driving this car. Aston, you should have done this from factory, but I'm glad we got the next best thing. So then, all that remains to be said from me is a huge thank you to Simon for letting me borrow his car, and to Nicholas Mee for facilitating it. Don't forget to hit the like button, comment down below, and subscribe if you haven't already. I'll see you for the next one. Bye-bye.